The feminists, of course, would be outraged, but mind you, that was the 1950s and everybody thought like that back then. That voice was one of the best known in radio in its golden years. The voice, the star of the series, was Ken Wayne. Ken, how did you come to win that particular role?
Well, it was funny, Cal, because as a matter of fact, two other actors were tried out for it. And I was asked to play the part of the police sergeant, who was a sort of a semi-regular character. He came in about every 1 out of 3 or 4 episodes or something. So they did it once, and about a year went by, and it didn't sell, and then we did it again suddenly with another actor, and Paul Jacklin, the producer, said, I want you to do this police sergeant again. And we did a second pilot, and of course, all the time, while I was listening carefully to the Larry Kent part, thinking I'd love to get my hands on this. I can't understand why this thing doesn't sell. So that was the second time. It didn't sell. About a year went by, and suddenly Paul Jacklin called me and he said, "How would you like to play Larry Kent?" And I said, "Well, I thought you'd never ask. I've been waiting to have a crack at it." So in those days, we did it on acetate. Discs was pre-tape. And I think it was a Thursday we cut the pilot. It was played to the sponsor the next day, on the Friday, and it was bought immediately and on the air on Monday.
That's amazing.
And Jacklin said, "We haven't got a scriptwriter. We haven't even got a second episode yet. Do you know anybody?" And they happened to be an American writer who'd stayed here after the war. And I said, "I know a fellow over in Macquarie." And he said, "For God's sakes, tell him to come over and see me." And he came over, and off we went. And I think he wrote for about 5 or 6 years. And then an interesting thing happened. We changed writers, and we had Freddie Parsons, the famous comedy writer who used to write for Roy Reen, Moe, and George Wallace and Tivoli and so on. And of course everybody was staggered that suddenly Freddie was a great dramatic writer as well.
Mind you, Larry Kent often had a lot of very smart responses, and I can see a comedy writer fitting into that role very well.
Sure. And the marvellous thing about Freddie was that because he'd been writing for particular performers, like Roy Reen and Wallace, as I say, he had that marvellous thing of suddenly studying an actor and the characterization he was doing and knowing, and we almost had a sort of a code, because Freddie would write a particular line. He'd hear me do something, and he'd think, "That's good. I can make introduce a little bit of a gag or something."
Yes.
And Freddie would write a line, and I'd look at it and I'd say, "I know exactly what Freddie wants me to do with this."
Yes, yes.
And we had that sort of a
that rapport is good, isn't it?
Marvellous, yeah. For a writer who writes for a particular person.
And what year was it that began?
That began in 49 and ran for 10 years, right up to 59, when I think that was the last show to go off the air when television then had started.
Right, it was 50 episodes a year back in those days, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So there was 500 programs you did, 52?
I think so, yeah.
Every week of the year.
Yeah.
We're listening today to episode 119, so that's fairly early in the third year, actually. So that was when it peaked very early, didn't it?
Well, yeah, the tag to that story is it was on the air on the Monday. We didn't even have a second episode written, and within a month it was rating about a 40 or something, which was that's still a huge rating nowadays, isn't it?
It is indeed. In fact, you were telling me before that you succeeded in outrating the things that before then had been considered unbeatable, such as Australia's Amateur Hour.
Yes. Jack Davey, Bob Dyer, and the Amateur Hour, which I don't think had ever been outrated by anything else.
Yes.
I don't think it wasn't outrating it all the time, but it managed to top even the Amateur Hour, which and I should have been rich.
Did they make you rich in those days, or did they simply pay you ordinary actors' fees?
They paid us very badly, and that was one of the troubles, and I think that was one of the reasons why in those days actors had to go overseas. You see, they had to get out of Australia because we were very badly ripped off, in fact.
In fact, the other thing that I noticed actors had to do was to do a lot of work.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. You worked all day long. You worked that show took me 1 hour. It was a half-hour show. That's right, 1 hour.
To put it down on...
To put it down. And sometimes I might do two, but that took 1 hour of 1 day a week. So I'd leave and go across the street to 2UE or somewhere else and do When a Girl Marries or some other, Superman or whatever.
Right.
So then you might be rehearsing a Sunday Lux Radio Theatre. So, of course, you had to do... literally,
in fact, I can remember as a small boy in short pants, I can remember hearing you do Larry Kent, and at the same time you were Grogan the Outlaw, chasing Smokey Dawson.
Yeah, there's a funny story. I was talking to old Smokey not long ago. I became Grogan the Big Heavy, the protagonist. And I was so evil and I committed so many crimes and so many murders that they finally had to bring me to justice, you see. Because I'd always escape in the gunfights with Smokey. And finally, they said he's got to go. And so I think I was shot and killed off by Smokey. This is interesting of the way radio was in those days. There was such an uproar from the listeners about Grogan being killed off, and so many phone calls and letters and what have you, that they decided they'd bring me back as his brother to avenge... Yeah.
I think that's wonderful. We'll be back with more of the golden years of radio after this break. In this hour of the golden years of radio, it's the Larry Kent story starring Ken Wayne. And I think what we might do before we talk a little more to Ken is to go back and find out what Larry Kent is up to. What will happen to Larry Kent? Time alone will tell. We'll take a break and then we'll come back with more of the golden years of radio. In this hour of the golden years of radio, it's the Larry Kent story starring Ken Wayne. Ken, your popularity in those days was phenomenal. What sort of fan mail did you get?
Oh, used to get a lot of stacks of fan mail, and you used to get into a lot of trouble too, because you'd have... I remember being stopped one day in Castlereagh Street, and the girl said, "Oh, you..." She worked in some factory somewhere or something, and she said, "Oh, you were out last night. My girlfriend was out with you last night." And I said, "Oh, is that right?" And she said, "Yes," and her name was so-and-so. And of course it didn't mean anything to me. But this girl apparently had gone into and said that she'd been out with me the night before and painted this lurid picture of...
the price of stardom.
Yeah. So it had weird... we had one thing I remember, because one of the innovative things about the show was... In those days, all the radio shows and all the series that we used to do, soapies and so on, were all American scripts. They'd buy them from America. And they were all set in some mythical American town, and everything was done with American accents, because, Australians were still had a complex about anything local had to be second-rate, second best. We were the first ones. We took the script and then adapted it to Sydney. So I was saying things like I jumped in a cab and went to Double Bay, or I was up in Paddington, and so on. And I even used to mention real people, blokes around the cross that I knew.
Real restaurants too. I remember in one episode mentioning Romanos, I think, or Princes or somewhere.
People were identifying with that. Prior to that, I think the only Australian thing was Dad and Dave or something.
Right.
It had to be British or American. And I remember one instance of I said something like, "Okay, I'll see you tomorrow on the steps of the GPO in Martin Place." And the publicity department said, "Might be a good idea for you to go down, and we'll get a picture." And they said, "Now, in case nobody turns up, we'll take half a dozen girls from the office, and we'll take a picture of you with the girls." So I got down there about 5 minutes before the time we'd said, 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock. And the George Street was jammed with thousands of people, and they were running into the GPO and grabbing the telegram forms for me to sign, and grabbed me by the collar And I was hauled away because the traffic was being stopped in George Street. Yeah, I've got a picture of that, in fact.
That's amazing, the power of radio in those days to stop the traffic. Listen, we'll talk a little more about it in a moment, Ken, but I want to stop for the moment because I'm worried about what's happening to Larry Kent. The last time we heard from him, he was being shot at. Well, we'll find out what's happened to Millie and what happens to Larry Kent a bit later. That program had a lot of innovations in it, didn't it, Ken?
Yes, it did. That was part of its big success. Firstly, in those days, all the soapies, they bought most of them from America, and then local writers would adapt them. But they were all set in some mystical American town, or I was walking down the street in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And people still had a complex about, setting a play. Nobody's going to be interested in something that's set in Australia. So we, of course, used to had the character of Larry Kent set in Sydney, and I used to say things like, I got a cab and went to Double Bay, or I'll meet you at Martin Place, or so on. And I used to often use real people's names, people I knew.
But as well as that, it was also innovative in terms of technique, wasn't it?
That's right. In those days, firstly, I used to work on a microphone by myself, and the rest of the cast would be on another microphone.
And the standard thing was for all the actors and actresses to stand around a single mic, wasn't it?
Single mic, yeah.
Yes.
Because I was doing the first-person narration. Now, that was something new, so that the audience were being taken with me. As I said, I walked down I climbed up the stairs and knocked on the door, and and the door opened, and there she was. So the audience, it's a first-person narration. Plus, another thing, that producers were terribly frightened of dead air. You're not supposed to pause. You had to keep talking because it was a radio. And we introduced, now that may sound now even slightly stylized, but it was. And we did whole scenes with just monosyllabic dialogue, with pauses, not a lot of... So the listener creates their own picture in their mind. And they're not just... Everything isn't explained to them. There are whole scenes there where I'm saying, yeah, and what happened then? Uh-huh. And, that was new because radio producers were terrified of pauses on the air. But a pause can be as alive as a word if, you're allowing the audience to create their own images.
We'll be back with more of the Golden Years of Radio after this break. On this hour of the Golden News of Radio, it's the Larry Kent story, starring Ken Wayne. Ken, where did that distinctive and striking voice come from? Were you just born with it? Did you develop it?
No, I didn't develop it, because nobody ever hears their own voice, do they? I remember my first show, the first job I did in radio was for Grace Gibson, and I was very excited about it. And I went home, and it was a couple of weeks later before it came on the air, and here it was, and I sat down and I started to listen to the show, and I didn't come in for a long time and didn't have a big part, and I thought, here I come. The door opened and in I came, and I thought, oh my God, I don't sound like that. Everybody else sounds...
Yes.
And of course the same thing happens when you see yourself on the screen. Everybody else looks normal. So you never hear yourself. The American thing's easy for me. I've been I was away overseas for a long time, and I've been playing American parts in American movies in Europe. And why it's easy for me, some accents are easy for some actors and others are...
Sure.
I can't do Scots.
Right.
You could offer me $1,000, I can't do a Scots accent. But I have, for some reason... an American delivery.
Yes, to do with pace and feeling and so on.
Yeah, so that's I think why that
acting?
Sort of style of thing is easy.
Why acting? How did you enter the acting profession in the first place?
Well, I didn't. I wanted to do that right from the time I was a kid. I started when I was a kid. I started when I was about 11 or 12, and I started with Ken Hall. Out of the old...
Ken G. Hall,
out of the old Cine Sound Studios. Pete Finch was a young, juvenile actor then. and in the old Cinesound studios at Bondi Junction. And then I did the very, very successful picture called Sons of Matthew.
Yes, Michael Pate was in that.
Excuse me, Michael Pate, as a matter of fact, at the moment, has a script that he's just been working on for a long time, and he's trying to set up a remake of something. He's going to do a remake.
What a nice idea.
Yeah. I was talking to him the other day, and he was telling me, and he was saying how great my part, Barney was my character, and he's written the part of Barney, and it's terrific, and he does this and he does that. And I said, shut up, don't tell me anymore, because I can't play it. And,
Yes. Mind you, the one thing that doesn't change with the years is the voice. The voice sounds to me now exactly the way it did in those days.
Yes, it does, yeah. Well, it's funny for me listening to those excerpts there, because it's like I can't identify with it. It's like listening to somebody else. You're so far removed that you can be completely objective, and it's like listening to another person. It's strange.
What I'd like to do at this stage
Stands up well, though, doesn't it?
it does.
After all
they
these
still
years.
work well. What I'd like to do at this stage is to find out the solution to the mystery. Let's
Right.
go back to Larry Kent. He never missed out on the women, and he always solved the mysteries. He was an amazing character. Did you like Larry Kent? How did you feel about him, Ken?
Yes, because he was not. He wasn't a Superman. He didn't. We introduced, even before all the things that all the Bond movies and everything have done since, Sex, which was then pretty. As a matter of fact, I remember the show was banned in New Zealand. They wouldn't have it down there. It was too rude.
I'm not surprised. We know about New Zealand.
And sex and crime and action and so on. We always assumed that the character, because I was too young to play it visually, we always assumed the character was probably in his 40s, early 40s, maybe.
And you were in your 20s at the time.
Yeah, and a bit jaded, seen it all, The character was... we justified it being an American because, as I say, at that time, everything was being done. That he was a guy who was been in Australia during the war and decided to settle, which a lot of Americans did. So that made... and what I liked about it was he used to get beaten up and he didn't always score, and, so he was human. He wasn't a Superman.
Ken Wayne, thank you for being with us this hour, and thank you for the great Larry Kent character. Thank you for being part of the golden years of radio.